I'd like to talk about our contemporary crises in the context of history and culture and citizenship. And if you try to make sense of the nonsense that we're seeing every day, it's very difficult. Just think of the images on our television screens we've seen. We saw these poor refugees flying in, 100,000 of them. And I was watching the screen. I had great empathy, but I realized that we had not screened them, and that the soldiers who were entrusted with their lives, I think maybe wisely or unwisely, were asked, or not, I should say mandated, to get a vaccination. They're citizens, but the refugees who were arriving were not. How could such a thing be true? And after risking all of their lives, the commander in charge of the relocation said, I want to reassure the American people that we have the proper gender ratios in the plane and we have culturally sensitive food. I said, the United States just suffered the most humiliating defeat since Saigon 1975. What's going on? 2 million people are crossing the border in this fiscal year. The first act is to illegally cross a non-existent border. The second act is to illegally reside in a country that they don't have legal permission to do so. And the third is to find identification that's not legitimate to legitimize what was illegitimate. And yet nobody raises a word. And I was looking at wage gains of the middle class. A person was on television and said, we've had enormous 3.5% wage gains, but I thought, wait a minute, the annual price consumer index is rising at 6%. So what is all this, what's going on in the United States? We say it's wokeness, it's chaos, it's COVID, it's a lockdown, it's a recession, it was Trump, it's Biden. I think it's a destruction in the idea of a citizen, us, people that had a very exceptional. I want to say very quickly, that is a very rare idea. We assume that since the dawn of civilization 7,000 years ago in the Near East, everybody was a citizen. They weren't. They were subjects, they were servants, they were slaves, they were serfs. It was only in Greece 2,500 years ago, very late, was there an idea that a polites, politics, and later in Rome, 500 years later, a Kiwis, civilization, emerged. And this was a unique idea that the people, the residents, had legal status, started out, believe it or not, the right to pass on property to your heirs without interference from the government. That seems so crass, but that's what started citizenship. The right then to determine when you and when you would not fight, and who would fight, and your national cause, whether you would have a border or not have a border, and then the idea of freedom of speech and expression came later. But it was a very rare idea. It's rare today. Of the 190 nations in the world, less than half of them are what we would call constitutional, with true citizens. So we have to remember that this idea of a multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy, it's never been tried before. India's trying it, and Brazil, and those are the only two large countries that can try it, and they don't do very well. So the idea that we're going to have to be perfect to be good, when all we have to do is be far better than the alternative, this is a new idea, this demand on perfection on a very rare incident in the history of civilization. So what's happening to citizens? I think it's being assaulted, it being citizenship, organically, insidiously, from what I call the pre-modern level. And the first, of course, is you cannot have a citizen unless you have a middle class. That goes back to Aristotle, and it's a theme throughout Western thinking to Alexis de Tocqueville. And why did they say that? Because they felt that the rich had inordinate power to influence government officials in quid pro quo fashion, and the poor would always be dependent either on the rich or on the government for subsidies. But only the independent, first it was the independent landowner. We changed that idea in evolutionary, the middle class homeowner, the small business person. But they were economically and politically autonomous, and they took on the responsibility, time-consuming, to participate in constitutional government. And what's happened? Until 2017, we'd have 13 years of economic stagnation. We have right now 45% of Americans die with less than $10,000 in net worth. And most people, 50% die with money on their credit card that hasn't been paid back. I think the most frightening is we have $1.7 trillion in aggregate debt right now, student debt, in some kind of nefarious bargain between the federal government and these huge universities that raise the cost of tuition and the room and board faster than the rate of inflation because there's no moral hazard. The federal government comes in and subsidizes that loan, and they don't give a damn about what happens to the student when they graduate, whether they're prepared to get a job or whether they can service that debt. 20% of the debts are not going to be paid back. About 30% are inactive. And it has repercussions on the middle class. The age when people marry has gone from 23 to 30. The age of a first child is 25 to 32. And the age when people buy their first home, it's now, we had made enormous strides at the turn of the millennium. We got up to 64% home ownership. We're going backward now. And you can see this housing boom in California. Nobody can buy a home that's middle class. But we're doing something that, again, I don't want to quote all the philosophers, but Tocqueville said one of the great dangers of a maternalistic democracy is prolonged adolescence. These are people who do not want to go out and face life, get married, have children. Whether they want to have children doesn't immaterial. Buy a home, be productive. And you can see it in the government. During the Obamacare controversy, do you remember the pajama boy ad where we were all supposed to listen to a man with footsies, and he was in his 20s, and he was in his pajamas drinking hot chocolate, and he said, drink hot chocolate, be cool, get Obamacare. I thought, who in the world would be attracted? And then I was told it was a great success. The other ad was The Life of Julia. Do you remember that ad? Julia, when she was born, her mother had, fine, good, noble thing, federal prenatal care. When she was born, she had 1 to 3 federal assistants. She went into a federal this and federal that. And it was bragging on the idea that from the moment she was born to the moment she died. And I thought cradle to grave was a pejorative, but I saw today that the new reconciliation bill is called cradle to grave benefits in the positive sense. There's nothing more injurious to citizenship and a democracy than to have a prolonged adolescent generation. It just doesn't work. The second challenge is, in the ancient world, people loved borders. The Greeks would have something called a horos, a stone that marked out the limits of Thebes or Corinth or Thespe or Sparta. And sometimes they were natural, sometimes they were artificial, but borders were really important. Wars started in the ancient world over borders. Now, why was that? Was it because they were chauvinistic? Was it they were militaristic? No, they felt that if you did not have a special place, a landscape in which everybody shared common values, traditions, holidays, rituals, you could not inculcate a cultural and social aspect that would reinforce constitutional government. We have no border in the South now. We have 50 million people living in the United States, legally and otherwise, that we don't know their status, but they were not born in the United States. Some are citizens, some are legal residents. But 20 million we know are illegal residents. So we are creating caste of citizenship. When you see a person, 27% of the California population was not born in the United States. So that means when I see somebody, I don't know to what degree we have a commonality other than just residing there. Do they believe in Christmas? Do they know what Iwo Jima was? Do they have any knowledge of Gettysburg? All of the civic rituals that are so important to reinforce a constitutional system. It can't exist as just politics. You have to reinforce it constantly with shared experiences, even a shared physical space. And if you don't have that, you have nothing. And yet we have destroyed the idea of a border. And why? We're all guilty. Central American governments in Mexico this year will get $60 billion in remittances from people illegally. It's the largest source of foreign exchange. And guess what? Most of that money will be freed up because the federal, local, and state government are subsidizing people to allow them to have extra cash to send back to countries that will either cannot or will not help their own people. It used to be common knowledge in Mexico, it still is, it's a safety valve. Rather than marching on Mexico City, you'll go to the United States. So it really is deleterious to the Mexican people, because a system that is inherently racist and unfair, the dissident doesn't agitate, they come here. It's almost like the reverse of Frederick Jackson Turner theory of the frontier, only we're the frontier. Second thing is, all of us, and especially in places on the bi-coastal, we have created an aristocracy that depend on cheap labor. When I was growing up, I don't remember people in California of the upper middle class having a gardener, a nanny, a cook, and yet they assume that that's a birthright. And they're not worried about what the mechanics of that are, or the results on a society at large. And this is not just the left, it's the corporate right as well, that wants cheap labor and has driven down wages for the middle class. And of course, then there's the Democratic Party. They feel that these constituents that you see on your screen will have fealty to their party because they will be generous in the entitlements. They feel that there'll never be a California of Ronald Reagan, George McMason, Pete Wilson, even Arnold Schwarzenegger. It's over with. And they have flipped Nevada. They feel they flipped New Mexico. They're about to flip Arizona. They think they flipped Colorado. And it's a premeditated idea of bringing people in. And so there was a lot of guilty parties. But you cannot have citizenship when people are residents and we don't know that there's any difference between castes. It used to be that a citizen was eligible for federal entitlements. They were allowed, and only they were allowed, to go in and out of the country because they had something after 1941 called a passport, and they were responsible for military service, and they alone could hold office or vote. I don't know how many of those still apply. I don't think any of them do. We have people, I think it's a noble thing, that are in the military that are not only not citizens but here illegally. We have people going back and across the border that don't need to have a citizen's passport. If I come in or you come in from Europe and you don't have a passport, you're not going to get into the United States. You can come across the border and get in the United States without a passport. In California, in the local election board in the Bay Area, you don't have to be a citizen to vote. All I can see the difference now is that a citizen still can hold office and somebody who's illegally here or a mere resident that's not a citizen cannot. I think that's just about ready to go as well. There's a third thing that we were warned about antiquity, and that's the danger of tribalism. When you read a historian like Thucydides, they always start with the idea that a pre-civilization, pre-modern society has no meritocracy. You hire your first cousin, or your general appearance is essential, not incidental to who you are. And the tribe then is the enemy of progress, it's the enemy of meritocracy. I've been, I think, to every country in the Middle East except Iran. When I talk to people, journalists there, they always say something. It's a constant refrain. The reason that things don't work here is because we hire our first cousin, and we don't hire the most capable person, because we judge people by their blood ties or their superficial appearance. We had been fighting with a legacy of slavery and Jim Crow in the South. We're now in 50 years since the Civil Rights Movement and affirmative action, and we were starting to realize Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream of the content of our character rather than this color of our skin, and we've gone back 50 years with this woke movement. This woke movement was not started grassroots. This is a top-down phenomenon. This is Oprah Winfrey from her $90 million estate in Montecito complaining about ill treatment to Meghan Markle in her $15 million mansion. This is Barack and Michelle Obama worth $100 million coming out and then pontificating on the unfairness as they go back to their 38-acre, $14 million Martha Vineyard estate. I could go on, but you get the picture. The BLM founder, Phyllis Queller, she's on house number 4 in Topanga Canyon. Professor Kendi, if you want to hear him, it's $20,000, $333 a minute for his advice about how you must be racist to stop racism and you must discriminate to stop discrimination. And Ta-Nehisi Coates, sort of the godfather, the guru of wokeism, he's making a fortune writing comic books and comic book screenplays for Hollywood. These are not revolutionaries out on the barricades. This is an elite-driven drive for the spoils of America, camouflage as if America is culpable.